I first crossed paths with Jane during my service aboard the USNS Comfort, a Mercy-class hospital ship deployed to aid Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. At that time, I was a Lieutenant JG with a mere 2 months left in my 6-year stint in the Navy, eagerly anticipating my honorable discharge and return to civilian life. The prospect of transitioning to civilian life seemed promising, buoyed by my experience leading a team of machinist mates, which I believed would open up numerous career opportunities. Jane, a recent college graduate with a nursing degree, was among the civilian volunteers on board, contributing to post-operative care. Our initial encounter occurred while my crew was addressing an issue in her ward. Instantly captivated by her physical allure, a statuesque 5'8" figure with a slim, athletic build, complemented by long blonde hair, blue eyes, and a captivating smile, I endeavored to engage her in conversation without intruding on her responsibilities. Despite the stringent regulations regarding interpersonal relationships on the ship, Jane and I managed to share several meals together over the ensuing weeks. Our interactions left me eager to delve deeper into her world, a sentiment she seemingly reciprocated by entrusting me with her parents' contact information and her cell number, paving the way for plans to reconnect post-discharge. Within a week of leaving the service, I found myself at the doorstep of Jane's family home in suburban Philadelphia. Welcomed warmly by her parents, Paul and Rose, our evening unfolded in the comfort of their hospitality, marked by shared laughter and a delicious home-cooked meal. Despite our divergent military backgrounds, Paul and I quickly bonded, his Air Force service bridging any perceived inter-service divide. It was during this visit that Paul's suggestion led me to a job opportunity in Philadelphia, setting the stage for my subsequent career path. Navigating the progression of my relationship with Jane proved to be a gradual journey, hindered by the conservative values of her Catholic upbringing and the constraints of her living arrangements. It took months before our romantic connection culminated in an intimate encounter, characterized by its simplicity yet profound significance. Our union blossomed over the following months, culminating in marriage 10 months after my relocation to Pennsylvania. With stable careers established, we opted to postpone starting a family, channeling our energies into financial security and cherishing each other's companionship. Our honeymoon, a blissful escape to the Caribbean, epitomized our shared sense of adventure and newfound freedom, epitomized by Jane's unexpected embrace of naturism, a departure from her typically reserved demeanor, yet a testament to our evolving intimacy. The third night aboard the boat became a pinnacle moment in my life, resonating with an unparalleled sense of magic. Jane and I concluded a delectable meal featuring red snapper paired with a splendid Burgundy Chardonnay, setting the stage for an enchanting evening. Nestling atop a blanket on the deck, we gazed upon a celestial tapestry of a million stars, where 2 shooting stars streaked across the vast expanse. Our love transcended into an intimate embrace, culminating in a tranquil slumber cradled in each other's arms, cocooned in a world of our own creation. 2 days hence, we navigated into the serene cove adjoining Orient Bay, venturing ashore for a leisurely swim. Jane was taken aback to discover the naturist enclave of Orient Bay, where clothing was but an optional adornment. As she stood adorned in her scantiest bikini, I seized the opportunity to astonish her by shedding my swim trunks, invoking the age-old adage, when in Rome. Undeterred by my spontaneity, Jane opted to retain her modest attire, even as we strolled along the sandy expanse adjacent to the naturist resort. By the time we returned to the resort's Papagayo restaurant, Jane had relinquished her top, although she remained steadfast in preserving some semblance of modesty. Replete with towels, sunscreen, and a modest sum of money, we secured a pair of beach chairs and a bucket of beers, savoring the sun-drenched ambience. Jane, ever mindful of her reserved nature, chose to maintain the sanctity of certain intimacies, reserving her bikini bottoms for my exclusive gaze. Our idyllic day of sun and surf did little to quell the burgeoning ardor between us, as evidenced by an evening spent entwined in passion aboard our vessel, anchored off Pinal Island before our return journey to Marigot. Over the ensuing 6 years, our affinity for the island drew us back on 9 occasions, whether by sailboat or lodging on Orient Beach. Jane remained steadfast in her preference for partial nudity, her bikini bottoms progressively diminishing in coverage, yet preserving a modest allure. Our anticipated 10th visit was abruptly overshadowed by the devastation wrought by Hurricane Irma, evoking haunting memories of Haiti's cataclysmic aftermath. However, amidst the wreckage, an opportunity arose for Jane to lend her expertise to the reconstruction efforts in Marigot, rekindling echoes of her humanitarian endeavors in Haiti. As Jane shared her aspirations with fervor, I couldn't help but marvel at her unwavering commitment to service, despite the uncertainties looming over our future. And you didn't think we should discuss this beforehand? Of course we would have, it just didn't occur to me that you might not be on board. I haven't committed to anything yet. I'm sorry if I jumped the gun, I was just so thrilled when I got the email today. What about our plans to start a family? You stopped taking the pill last month. Can we postpone it for a few months? Just a few months, I promise. We'll be careful until I return. We can use condoms until then. Please? It took over an hour before I finally saw eye to eye with Jane. This was a significant opportunity that extended beyond our personal plans. It was about helping those we care about. I took a few days off to accompany Jane to St. Martin and help her settle in. We arrived at SXM on Thursday and rented a car. Despite having a condo for the weekend, our first stop was the charity's offices, followed by the apartment where Jane would stay. We met her roommate, Allison Parker, and took her out to dinner. The more I spoke to Allison, the more I warmed up to her. She seemed responsible and happily married. By the time we dropped Allison off and headed to Orient Bay, my anxiety had significantly eased. Friday morning, Jane and I went for a run on the beach. As we jogged, we encountered a man jogging towards us. We exchanged greetings cordially, nothing out of the ordinary. Upon reaching the end of the bay and turning around, we encountered the same jogger again. This time, he stopped. Bonjour. To my surprise, Jane stopped as well. Bonjour. The man extended his hand to me. Are you Americans? I shook his hand. How did you guess? Just a hunch, the clothes, the friendliness earlier, the accent. My name is Jean-Paul. I'm Richard, and this is my wife, Jane. Jean-Paul shook her hand. Pleased to meet you. It's always nice to meet new people, especially since the beach has been so deserted since Irma, especially at this time of year. Jean-Paul's gaze lingered a bit too long on Jane, understandable given her appearance in her jogging attire. It annoyed me when Jane mentioned our plan to visit the nude beach. Sure enough, he showed up that afternoon, positioning himself next to Jane. He made a show of applying sunscreen, especially in certain areas. He spent the next hour regaling us with his life story, while I struggled to stay engaged. It turned out he was a French national assisting with reconstruction efforts on the island. He claimed to be single. No wife, no kids. I bought the first round, and when I returned from the bar, Jean-Paul was lying on his stomach, smirking at me. 30 minutes later, Jean-Paul offered to buy the next round and left. During his absence, I tried to steer the conversation away from our unwelcome guest. Just as I broached the subject of dinner, Jean-Paul returned with our drinks. Jane turned to Jean-Paul. We were just discussing dinner. Do you have any recommendations? Our favorite restaurant has closed since Irma. Let me take you to my new favorite spot in Marigot. It will be my treat. I struggled to conceal my irritation, but before I could decline his offer, Jane responded, That's very kind of you. Can we pick you up on our way? And so, we found ourselves spending our Friday evening with the Frenchman. Dinner was enjoyable, although I could have done without Jean-Paul's patronizing demeanor. Like many Frenchmen, he seemed to harbor a certain disdain for Americans, particularly our military. He made several disparaging remarks about U.S. decisions, and while I refrained from agreeing with him outright, I held my tongue to avoid giving him ammunition to use against me with Jane. I'd been down this road before. Jane seemed to relish being the center of attention, and while I should have been more concerned by her flirtatious behavior, I reminded myself that this was Jane we were talking about, the woman who had always been the epitome of propriety, the dutiful daughter and wife. We took turns dancing with Jane, and I couldn't help but notice Jean-Paul's attempts to encroach on her space. Each time, I swiftly intervened, much to his chagrin. When I finally decided it was time to leave, he attempted to provoke me with a snide comment. I would have left him there, but he walked out with us, and I ended up giving him a ride home. As I pulled up in front of his apartment, he made another attempt to provoke me by kissing Jane. She seemed taken aback, and I was relieved to see that she didn't reciprocate the gesture. That night, we made love, albeit with the frustrating barrier of condoms between us. I missed the intimacy of our connection. I resolved to steer clear of the jerk for the remainder of the weekend, dropping hints to Jane about my dislike for him and hoping she would pick up on my discomfort. She didn't argue, and I thought I had made my point. As I prepared to catch my flight home, I made sure to express my love for her and to urge her to stay safe. We spoke on the phone almost every night during the first week, but as time went on, the calls became shorter and less frequent. By the end of the third week, I grew increasingly concerned and made plans to fly down the following weekend. We had a lengthy conversation on Thursday, during which I shared my intention to visit the next Friday and stay until Sunday. What I didn't reveal was that my return flight was actually scheduled for Tuesday, her birthday was on Monday, and I wanted to surprise her. Jane greeted me at the airport with a kiss and a hug, informing me that she had booked a bungalow in Phillipsburg for us. She claimed she was tired of the French side and wanted a change of scenery. While her decision struck me as odd, I was determined to make the most of the weekend and reconnect with my wife. Complaining about her plans wouldn't set the right tone for the start of our weekend together. The first inkling of trouble arose when Jane undressed that night. Despite the dim lighting, I couldn't discern any trace of tan lines. We made love, albeit with condoms, and in the darkness, I couldn't confirm my suspicions. So, I resorted to a discreet tactic. I stayed awake until she drifted off and used the flashlight on my phone. To my dismay, there was no evidence of any lines, not even a hint of a thumb mark. The following morning marked the beginning of a downward spiral for the weekend. When I broached the subject of the missing tan lines, Jane grew defensive, concocting a tale about tanning privately on their deck and questioning, "Don't you trust me?" I found myself grappling with the appropriate response. In hindsight, I should have taken decisive action, perhaps whisking Jane away and seeking counseling if infidelity had indeed occurred. But at that moment, it felt like a solitary battle to salvage our marriage. We went through the motions on Saturday and Sunday until I feigned my departure from the island on Sunday afternoon. Originally, I planned to surprise Jane on Monday morning at her apartment, spending the day together. However, after the dismal weekend, I reconsidered my plans. We exchanged goodbyes at the hotel, Jane purportedly returning to her apartment in Marigot, and I supposedly en route to the airport. The fact that Jane didn't protest when I suggested she needn't accompany me to bid farewell at the airport underscored the depths to which our relationship had plummeted. She must have been in a rush, as she didn't notice when I redirected my cab to follow hers. Upon reaching the apartment where we had picked up Jean-Paul over a month ago, Jane entered without hesitation. Contemplating my next move, I resolved to confront them, clinging to a sliver of hope that it wasn't too late. However, before I could knock on the door, I overheard the damning sounds that shattered any remnants of optimism. They wouldn't have heard my knock amidst the clamor against the door and Jane's cries. Defeated, I returned to the airport. I had missed Sunday's flight home but managed to change my ticket to depart on Monday. Checking into a room, I drowned my sorrows in alcohol, unable to find solace in sleep. For reasons I can't quite fathom, I rose early on Monday morning. I purchased a bouquet of flowers and hailed a cab to Jane's apartment. Handing $20 to a passerby, I entrusted him with the flowers and a card I had purchased earlier. Observing from across the street, I watched as Allison answered the door, accepted the card, and vanished inside. Moments later, she returned the card to the messenger, who then relayed the flowers and the card back to me. "The lady says your wife no longer resides here," she provided the new address on the card. "I'm sorry," he conveyed, handing me the card where Jean-Paul's address was inscribed. "Want to earn another 20? We can walk down a quarter mile and deliver it there." "Sure." Silent footsteps echoed as we traversed the distance. I sensed the young man's discomfort, perhaps pitying me, the betrayed husband. He rapped on Jean Paul's door while I remained across the street in the park. From my vantage point, I witnessed the young man passing the cart and flowers through the open doorway. Upon his return, he somberly relayed, "Doesn't seem like she's yours anymore, sorry man." Neither of them bothered to cover up before he answered the door. I compensated him with the 20, and before we could retreat, Jean Paul emerged from the apartment, still unclothed, and flung the flowers over the railing. That afternoon, I boarded a flight home, commencing the dissolution of our marital ties. Guided by the counsel of a divorce attorney, I meticulously cataloged our financial assets, segregating funds and establishing individual accounts while disentangling myself from our joint credit card and checking account. My objective was to finalize preparations before formally declaring the end to our union to Jane. If Jane detected the absence of affection or warmth during our sporadic phone calls, she made no mention until the third week. Unexpectedly, she announced her return home without providing a reason over the phone. "Richard, you don't sound thrilled to have me back. What's the matter?" "Jane, you've been away for almost 8 weeks. The separation has been tougher than I anticipated. You'll see, everything will change once you're back. Let's discuss this on Saturday." Jane's discontent with my apparent indifference was palpable. Was she truly that oblivious? I had no intention of greeting Jane's return flight. I harbored no desire to lay eyes on her, entertain her excuses, or inquire about her motivations. After all, what if her explanations mess with your head? My heart had turned to stone, yet one formidable task remained. I drove to Rose and Paul's residence on Friday evening. They welcomed me warmly, unaware of the impending storm. "Richard, what a pleasant surprise. We didn't expect you until Sunday. We're eagerly awaiting Jane's return and Sunday dinner together." "Rose, Paul, I'm deeply sorry to break this news. Jane has a lover in St. Martin. To my knowledge, she's been involved with him for nearly the entirety of her absence." "That can't be. Not our Jane. There must be some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding. I confirmed it during my last visit there. She's moved out of her apartment and is now residing with a Frenchman she met." Rose wept, Paul seethed. "I refuse to believe it, there must be some error." "Well, you can confront her when she arrives tomorrow. You'll need to meet her flight, I'm finished with her. This envelope contains the divorce papers. She can have her lawyer contact mine, his card is enclosed. If necessary, I can arrange for formal service, but I fail to see the point. Our assets are divided evenly, and the apartment lease expires in 6 weeks, with rent already paid. This should afford her ample time to decide whether to renew or vacate." I tossed the envelope onto the sofa and departed. Naturally, the following day brought a flurry of calls and texts. Jane left pleading voicemails, urging me to converse with her. I responded solely with texts of my own. "Consult my attorney. It's over. Jane Davis." The moment Jean Paul came sprinting toward us on the beach, something stirred within me. How else can I explain the string of foolish decisions I made from that instant until I disembarked the plane at Kennedy? Richard was the man I envisioned spending my life adoring, the man with whom I hoped to build a family, the man who treated me with boundless affection and respect. Yet, I repaid his kindness with cruelty and disrespect. It all began when Richard and I paused on the beach that fateful day. Jean Paul exuded a captivating charm, his physique reminiscent of a Greek deity, albeit with a darker allure. He effortlessly charmed me, though I failed to discern his charm was aimed solely at me, and I remained oblivious to his subtle digs at Richard. Foolishly, I revealed our plan to visit the nude section of the beach that afternoon. So, it came as no surprise when Jean Paul appeared later that day. The notion that such a striking man might be drawn to me filled me with a sense of satisfaction. He made a deliberate show of removing his shorts, ensuring I was watching as he unveiled himself. His manhood, though soft, was impressive, easily 6 inches in length and remarkably thick. As Jean-Paul settled into a beach chair beside me, he effortlessly commandeered the conversation, and I willingly acquiesced. I've always been the quintessential good girl. Throughout high school and college, I prioritized my studies and soccer, seldom indulging in parties. On the rare occasions I did attend, they were the type my parents would approve of if they were aware. I remained a virgin until my sophomore year of college, saving myself for the boy I dated for nearly a year. Though heartbroken when we parted ways, I eventually found myself in the arms of another during my senior year. However, it didn't take long for me to realize that our connection was fleeting, and I ended the relationship before causing further pain. 6 months after graduation, Richard entered my life. I was elated when he pursued our chaste romance from the ship by visiting my parents' home. Both of my parents adored Richard. My father even considers him a son. Throughout our courtship, Richard exemplified the perfect gentleman, never pressuring me for intimacy and allowing me the time to confirm he was my soulmate before we shared our first night together. It was an experience imbued with love, and I'll forever cherish the look of adoration in his eyes as we became one. Richard proposed the following week, after obtaining my father's blessing, naturally. Our engagement was brief, our wedding blissful, and our honeymoon reminiscent of a scene from a romantic film, albeit with a minor hiccup when Richard lost his swim trunks and I opted to bare my top on a public beach. Our marriage was idyllic, and we were on the cusp of embarking on parenthood when I shattered it all. While my decision to volunteer at the clinic was largely altruistic, it was not without ulterior motives. 2 of my colleagues, both middle-aged nurses, poisoned my thoughts with their venomous words. They questioned my decision to marry young, planting seeds of doubt about what I might have missed out on. "Have you ever wondered what it's like to be with a real man?" they insinuated, their own loneliness and jealousy clouding their judgment. Regrettably, I was too blind to see through their deception. So, I saw the chance to take a break from my routine for a few months to ensure that starting a family at 28 was truly what I desired. I won't hide the truth or pretend otherwise. There was an undeniable attraction to Jean-Paul, and yes, his size did arouse my curiosity. A joke from one of my anatomy classes came to mind. There were supposedly 2 types of men, show-heirs and grow-heirs. But Jean-Paul introduced me to a third kind, a shower that also grew. He discreetly demonstrated this when Richard walked away to the beach bar. As soon as Richard was out of sight, Jean-Paul turned to face me, previously lying on his stomach in the lounge chair, now with an erection. His member was impressive, maybe 8 or 9 inches long and nearly as thick as a beer bottle, with a head resembling a mushroom. I tore my gaze away, meeting Jean-Paul's smirk smile, etching into my memory. Jean-Paul invited us to dinner as a gesture of thanks for spending the afternoon with him. Richard hesitated, but I accepted without consulting him, feeling it would be awkward for him to decline at that point. We picked up Jean-Paul at his apartment, had dinner in town, and ended up at a dance club down the block. I barely sat down that night. Both men vied for my attention on the dance floor, each trying to ignite my desire. Jean-Paul's subtle provocations intensified as he rubbed against me. When Richard finally suggested leaving around midnight, Jean-Paul made a snide remark about him being a buzzkill. Richard retorted, "No, it's just time for me to have my wife to myself, the way a happily married couple should." Jean-Paul seemed riled by this, taking it as a challenge. When he kissed me on the lips while exiting the car at his apartment, attempting to use his tongue, I firmly kept my lips sealed. Perhaps the only reason Richard and I didn't argue that night was because he could see I didn't reciprocate the kiss. The following morning, Richard suggested skipping the beach and treated me to lunch on the Dutch side of the island. That evening, we stayed in and shared a passionate night together. It was comforting to be in his embrace for one last night before our separation. On Sunday, as Richard dropped me off at Allison's apartment, his parting words lingered in my mind. "Remember how much I love you, how much I'll miss you. Be safe, love." During my first week back at work, Jean-Paul showed up, claiming to just want to say hello and inviting me to lunch. He behaved impeccably, allaying my suspicions. When Allison cautioned me to be wary around John Paul, I dismissed her concerns, inadvertently exacerbating the situation. "Just watch yourself around John Paul. Don't forget you're married to a wonderful man," she warned, unwittingly setting a troubling tone for the days ahead. The first Saturday, the staff went out to dinner together. John Paul somehow ingratiated himself with one of my coworkers and joined us at our table, charming everyone except Allison. He convinced me to revisit the same dance club where Richard and I had spent the night. For the next 2 hours, John Paul and I danced, our movements bordering on explicit, pausing only to grab another drink. Any semblance of gentlemanly conduct vanished after the second dance, his tongue tangled with mine, his hands exploring my body without restraint. He took liberties with me in public that I had never allowed Richard. Then, he took me back to his apartment and we had sex. There's no sugarcoating it. John Paul used my body, and my body responded. My arousal from our dirty dancing had left me wet, so as soon as the door closed, he undressed me, undressed himself, and pushed me onto the bed. Gripping my ankles, he spread my legs. "Put it in," he demanded. I hesitated, mindful of the fact that I wasn't on birth control. "I'm fixed, put it in," he insisted. I complied. John Paul allowed me to adjust to his size. The sensation of his mushroom head hitting my G-spot was exquisite. He knew how to pleasure a woman, skillfully teasing and stimulating me until I climaxed, releasing more moisture into my canal. Taking advantage of my wetness, he thrust deeper, his cock filling me almost to my belly button. His movements were deliberate, bringing me to another orgasm as he skillfully manipulated my body. With each thrust, I felt him penetrate deeper until I could feel him inside my womb. Despite any twinges of guilt, John Paul seemed to intuit my thoughts and desires. After our first encounter, we lay together until he wordlessly took me from behind, igniting another round of passion that culminated in shared satisfaction. As I drifted off to sleep, I found John Paul gazing at me. "Bon, you're awake," he murmured before initiating another intimate session, continuing our night of intense passion. Typically, I can't climax in the morning, and despite John Paul's prowess, I didn't that morning either. Still, it felt amazing. We showered together, enjoying each other's company until the warm water ran out. John Paul made coffee and prepared a simple breakfast of baguette. He even offered me a toothbrush, revealing a drawer full of them, which he found amusing. "Hurry up, we're going to the beach," he urged. "I'll need to grab my bathing suit. How will I explain last night to Allison?" I pondered. "You won't have to, you're not going home," he declared. "Why? Do you have a collection of bikinis in another drawer?" I joked. "No, but you can wear one of my t-shirts until we get to the beach." "You won't need a suit at the nude beach," he explained. "But I never go without at least a bottom, even if it's a thong," I protested. "That changes today," he stated firmly. We did indeed head to a nude beach, but not the one at Orient. Instead, we went to Cupikoi, a beach Richard and I had visited once before. John Paul seemed to revel in making me uncomfortable, pushing boundaries. He positioned our blanket near a group of young men, who kept sneaking glances in my direction, undoubtedly trying to see more. Feeling uneasy, I retreated into the surf, wondering how much of John Paul's essence was still lingering inside me. John Paul joined me in the water and, much to my surprise, attempted to engage in intimacy right then and there. Despite his persistence, I declined, much to his displeasure. However, I allowed him to apply sunscreen on my skin, which nearly proved to be a mistake as it reignited my arousal. "Let's go back to your place," he suggested. We returned to his apartment and indulged in 2 more rounds of passion before he brought me back to my apartment that evening. Once again, Allison offered her unsolicited opinion, warning me about John Paul and the potential damage to my marriage. I remained silent, retreating to my bedroom. Over the following 2 weeks, I split my time between my apartment and John Paul's. Allison's cold demeanor at work only added to my stress. Finally, on a Thursday, I made a decision. Jean Paul had suggested I move in with him earlier that week, and now I felt ready. Allison, Glenna is looking for a place to stay. Why don't I move out and give her my room? Is that okay? I proposed. Allison seemed relieved. Fine by me. When? Tomorrow, I declared. That evening, I packed my belongings and had a difficult conversation with Richard over the phone. I reassured him as best I could, but I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. We even made tentative plans for him to visit, but I knew I needed to keep him away from Marigot, my workplace, and Allison. The weekend Richard visited turned into a disaster. He put in too much effort, while I didn't put in any at all. I found myself pitying him, which led to disrespecting him. When Richard suggested I didn't need to accompany him to the airport, I was almost relieved. My stomach churned the entire weekend as I tried to conceal the betrayal of our marriage. I hailed a cab and went straight to the apartment I now shared with Jean Paul. As I entered, Jean Paul was already waiting. Without hesitation, he lifted my skirt, removed my panties, and probed my vagina with his finger. "Did you use condoms all weekend like I instructed?" he demanded. "Yes, Jean Paul." "He never ejaculated inside me," I replied. "Did you perform oral sex on him?" "I won't kiss you if you did," he warned. "No, I didn't perform oral sex. We only made love 3 times, and always with a condom," I assured him. "Good. This belongs to me," he declared, spitting on his hand, lubricating his member, and thrusting it into me. It didn't take long before I reached climax. He pressed me against the door, my legs draped over his arms as he pounded me, eliciting screams of pleasure. That weekend, how I treated Richard, how I disrespected him, all because Jean Paul demanded it, led to the complete breakdown of any self-respect I had left. Sunday night marked the first time I allowed Jean Paul, or any man, to engage in anal play with me. Although he didn't attempt penetration, he inserted his thumb while taking me from behind. A card and flowers from Richard arrived on Monday morning, forwarded by Allison. Jean Paul made a show of discarding the flowers and laughed at Richard's romantic gesture. "Wait until you see what I bought you for your birthday. Nothing is useless as flowers," he jeered. That evening, he unveiled his gift, a slim dildo which he used on me while performing oral sex. The ensuing orgasm was intense. On Wednesday, he had me mount him while inserting the lubricated dildo into my anus. The sensation was overwhelming, and I climaxed repeatedly until Jean Paul reached his peak. On Saturday night, we went clubbing, where Jean Paul's friend Simon joined us. They engaged in provocative dancing, drawing the attention of the bouncers, who eventually intervened, much to Jean Paul's annoyance. "Let's get out of here," Jean Paul declared as we made our way back to the apartment, with Simon still in tow. He produced a joint, sparking it up and passing it around. Taking a cautious puff, I found myself feeling increasingly lightheaded with each drag. By the time we arrived home, the joint had dwindled to ash. Once inside, Jean Paul poured shots of tequila, and soon we were settled, with Simon seated at the kitchen table while Jean Paul and I occupied the couch. Jean Paul wasted no time. He removed my top and began to suckle on my nipples in the dimly lit room, illuminated only by the city lights filtering through the blinds. Placing me on his lap, facing him, he continued his ministrations, sliding his fingers beneath my skirt and into my depths. His skillful manipulation of my G-spot and clit brought me to climax. With nimble fingers still working their magic, Jean Paul kissed me deeply, his mouth exploring mine while a second pair of hands joined in, caressing my breasts, teasing my nipples, and planting kisses on my neck. The sensual assault led to another peak of pleasure. As Simon withdrew, silent communication ensued, and Jean Paul resumed his passionate embrace until he lifted me from his lap. Standing, we shed our clothes, revealing Simon lying naked on our bed, his erection prominent and slick with lube. Though smaller than Jean Paul's, Simon's member still dwarfed my birthday gift. Directed by Jean Paul, I found myself positioned on the bed, facing Simon. At his urging, I tentatively lowered myself onto Simon's lap, feeling the initial intrusion as his slender shaft entered my back passage. With Jean-Paul's assistance, I was then laid back, Simon behind me, and Jean-Paul atop me. The dual penetration was overwhelming, a cacophony of sensations that blurred the line between pleasure and pain. I lost track of time as they used me in tandem, one climax blending into another until I was spent and tears mingled with the aftermath of pleasure, alcohol, and substances. When I awoke on Sunday morning, Simon had departed, leaving Jean-Paul to attend to me with a rare gesture, bringing me coffee as I lay in bed, drained from the night's excesses. Last night was quite the adventure. "Finish your coffee, we're off to the beach," Jean-Paul remarked casually, signaling a shift in our morning routine. Simon made 2 more appearances that week, engaging in his familiar activities. It was curious how Jean-Paul had his preferences: no oral sex if kissing was involved, and a strict condom policy for vaginal intercourse. However, he exhibited a peculiar laxity when it came to anal encounters, expressing his disdain for certain practices in a derogatory manner. On a fateful Tuesday, a nagging feeling prompted me to investigate, leading to a startling revelation: I was pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through my already tumultuous reality. How could this be? With Richard using condoms and Jean-Paul supposedly sterile, the situation defied logic. Determined to uncover the truth, I seized an opportunity to examine Jean-Paul's sperm under the microscope at the clinic. The results confirmed my suspicions: he had deceived me, and now I bore his child. Confronting him with the evidence, I expected at least a modicum of concern. Instead, I was met with callous indifference and disdain. His callous dismissal and the sting of his hand across my face shattered any illusions I harbored about our relationship. In that moment of clarity, I realized the depths of my folly. My life had become entangled in a web of deceit and immorality, and I was the architect of my own downfall. With newfound resolve, I resolved to extricate myself from this sordid affair and reclaim the remnants of my shattered dignity. Gathering my belongings, I sought refuge with Joan and made the decision to return home, intent on leaving this chapter of my life behind. The repercussions of my actions spread like wildfire, casting a pall over my departure. Allison's accusatory tone cut through the air as she approached me. "So, did he exploit you for his own gain? Did he use you as a pawn in his corrupt game with the city officials?" I was taken aback by her blunt inquiry. "What are you talking about?" "He's known for manipulating women like you to gain favors for his projects. I warned you to steer clear of him, but you were too blinded by your affair to listen. Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" "I tried, but you were too enamored with him to see reason. Now, you're nothing but a pawn in his schemes. Good luck trying to salvage your relationship with Richard. I'm pretty sure he's aware of what you've been up to down here. But Richard still loves me." As I boarded the plane home that Saturday, I clung to the hope that Richard would forgive me and that we could rebuild our life together. I was convinced that his love for me would prevail. Richard, about 3 weeks after Jane returned home, her parents paid me a visit. The atmosphere was heavy with solemnity, and their concern was palpable. They seemed surprised by my calm demeanor until I couldn't contain my emotions any longer. It was when Rose asked, "Isn't there anything you two can do to reconcile? You were perfect for each other." I felt a lump form in my throat as I struggled to articulate my response. I thought so too, that we were perfect together. But I overheard them, not half an hour after we parted ways at the hotel. She practically sprinted to his apartment, and when I approached the door to confront them, I heard everything. There was no mistaking what was happening, and I refused to remain with a woman capable of betraying the man she claims to love. "I'm sorry." Jane's attempts to contact me ceased after that meeting. The divorce papers were signed, and within 3 months, our marriage was dissolved. I didn't spiral into despair or drown my sorrows in alcohol every night. I was fortunate to have supportive friends and family who lent me an ear. However, the desire for retribution lingered in the back of my mind, fueled by memories of Jean-Paul's smug smile. It took time, but after 2 months, I was ready to enact my plan. I underwent a drastic transformation, altering my appearance significantly. Shedding my clean-cut image, I grew a beard and shaved my head. With added weight and a change of sunglasses, I became unrecognizable. I traveled to the Caribbean, prepared to carry out my scheme, fueled by a desire for justice. Tony Alborough and I had served together on the USS Shiloh, and we had stayed in touch ever since he moved back to his hometown near San Juan. It took him a moment to recognize me when I knocked on his door, but within 10 minutes, we were already on our first beers, and Tony knew exactly why I was there. "You're not planning to kill him, are you?" "I won't be involved in murder, even if the guy deserves it," Tony remarked, eyeing me cautiously. I showed Tony the tools of my revenge, and it elicited a chuckle from him. "All right, I can get on board with that plan. So, you need a boat big enough to get you to St. Martin but small enough to avoid drawing too much attention? We'll talk to Hector down at the pier tomorrow." Hector was more than willing to lend us one of the sailboats under his care, especially after I flashed the stack of $300 bills in front of him. Tony and I set out early Tuesday morning, just before the fishing boats departed. We sailed all day and anchored off the bay at Grand Case by 2 a.m. At 4 a.m., I slipped into the water and swam to shore. Jogging the 3.5 miles to the park opposite John Paul's apartment, I sat on the same bench I had occupied months earlier when I watched my wife enter that apartment. Taking a calculated risk, I waited and observed, hoping John Paul was a creature of habit. At 8 a.m., a young woman emerged from the apartment, followed by Jean Paul at 8:30. I trailed him at a safe distance as he entered a building, which turned out to be his workplace. Jogging back to Grand Case, I swam back to our boat, and Tony pulled up anchor. We spent the day sailing around Tintamar Island. That night, we sailed into Friars Bay. Tony didn't even bother lowering the anchor. I slid over the side with my tools in a waterproof pouch, and Tony sailed out of the bay. By 7:20 a.m., I was back at the park. 35 minutes later, the same woman exited the apartment. Waiting another 10 minutes, I crossed the street and knocked on Jean Paul's door. Jean Paul answered, wearing only a towel wrapped around his waist. Without giving him a chance to react, I zapped him with the taser. He didn't have time to recognize me. It was something I wrestled with. Part of me wanted him to know who was behind this, but I couldn't risk going to jail. Maybe someday, after the statute of limitations had passed, I'd reveal myself, if it still mattered by then. I closed the door behind me. While Jean Paul was incapacitated, I tied him to a chair, forced him to drink a sedative-laced bottle of water, gagged him, and attached the device. Did I ever mention the 3 summers the first spent during high school working on my uncle's ranch? One of the most unpleasant tasks, at least for me, was the annual castration of the bulls and horses. One of the ranch hands showed me how to use an old-school cattle castration bander. You tie it around the scrotum, give it a few hours, and voila, a pair of useless, shriveled balls. But something had to be done about that obscene cock, his pride and joy. A plastic zip tie placed 2 inches from the base cut off the circulation. In the future, he could use what remained of his cock to pee standing up, but it wouldn't be much use for pleasuring the ladies. Too bad. I wonder if that will wipe the smirk off his face. With any luck, it would be hours before anyone found the bastard. By then, the damage would be permanent. A quick jog back to Friars Bay, a swim out to the boat, and by late Thursday night, Tony and I were sailing back into the Fajardo Marina. By Saturday morning, I was home, shaved, and ready to go on a diet. As for revenge on Jane, not going to happen, for a number of reasons. First, I know she is suffering. Her parents lost a son, and she'll have to live with the knowledge she caused it. Second, I know there's someone else out there for me, and living well is the best revenge. And someday she'll realize all she gave up, our future, our kids, and yes, the love we shared during the first 6 years together. And lastly, not allowing her to apologize was probably the nastiest thing I could do, so there was my revenge if I'm being honest with myself. Jane, I moved in with my parents and started working at a hospital near their home while my belly grew. My parents forced me to see a therapist, said it was a requirement if they let me move back in and help take care of my child. It didn't take more than 6 sessions with the therapist to analyze where it all went wrong. The 2 harpies at my old clinic had set the stage. I was immature, allowing their taunts to feed my narcissism, thinking I deserved and needed to experience more out of life. I was frightened about becoming a mother and being tied down. Finally, I was primed to fall for a charming seducer who offered something forbidden. The therapy explained why I did it, helped me understand what I could do in the future if I ever got another chance at love, but didn't give me what I wanted more than anything else in the world: another chance with Richard. Martin was born on September 6th, exactly 1 year after Irma destroyed St. Martin. Epilogue: Jane. It was Martin's 7th birthday. Mom, Dad, and I took him to the Philadelphia Zoo. We were having a snack in the Tiger Terrace when I saw him. Richard was walking past the Big Cat Falls with a woman and 2 children. The older of the 2, probably a 4-year-old girl, was walking. The younger, maybe a 2-year-old boy, was riding on Richard's shoulders, laughing. The woman couldn't have been more different than me, 5'3" and curvy, brown hair and dark eyes. They were in their own little world and didn't notice us as they passed. I looked at my parents. Mom and Dad were watching them. Mom looked sad, but it was Dad that shook me. In my 35 years, I never saw my father shed a tear until that day. Thanks for watching and have a great day. Write your opinion in the comments. Remember, you're writing a story too, and it's up to you whether it's a good one or not.